Fancy. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy BookTube hats, and I am here today to tell you what I thought of the 3 fantasy novels that were nominated this year for the BooktubeSFF Awards in the adult fantasy category. I haven't had a chance to wrap any of these up yet, so this will serve as my wrap-up for these 3 books. I will also be sort of comparing them and explaining which one is my favorite and how I would rank the 3 of them. If you're unfamiliar with the BooktubeSFF Awards, I'm going to leave links to all of the information down below. The nominees in the adult fantasy category this year were The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And that's in the order that I read them, so that's the order that I'm going to wrap them up in. I will say my reactions to this shortlist were that they were all things I was happy to read. Both The Starless Sea and Gods of Jade and Shadow were books I was excited enough about before their release that I pre-ordered them. They were books I was super hyped about. And then Priory was one I had some trepidation about because I really didn't like The Bone Season by the same author. But this looked totally different, and I was willing to give it a try. And I was particularly pumped that all 3 of these nominees were standalones because I love fantasy standalones. They're sort of the bread and butter of my reading, and I sort of resent it when awards shortlists make me start all of these series that I wasn't intending on starting, and now I have all of these unfinished series that I wasn't, like, planning on getting into. So I'm going to start with The Starless Sea, which, spoiler, was my favorite of the 3. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it to pieces. I fully understand why this is not everyone's type of fantasy. I think the fantasy genre is very broad in the types of storytelling it can encompass, and this is different enough that it's not going to be what everyone wants in a fantasy novel, and I accept that, but I loved it. I was reading this fairly early on in the whole coronavirus lockdown quarantine scenario, and for me this book was just my entire lockdown mood. And not only because the main character spends a good deal of time sort of trapped alone in a weird underground place, but partially because of that. The protagonist of this book is named Zachary, and he is a grad student studying video game design. He finds an old book in his university's library that seems to contain all of these little anecdotal, fairy tale-ish stories that all relate to this magical underground library on the shore of the Starless Sea. Some of these stories seem unfinished. It's unclear how any of them connect, but the really weird thing is that Zachary recognizes that one of them is about him, specifically an instance from his childhood when he saw but did not open a magical-looking door painted on the wall of an alleyway. And soon this library mystery trying to track down the origins of this book called Sweet Sorrows becomes this entire adventure. The structure of this book is really important because we keep switching chapters between Zachary's chapters and every other chapter at the beginning of this book, Sweet Sorrows. You get a story from Sweet Sorrows interspersed. But Sweet Sorrows is just the first of several books within this book that get woven in to the story this way. And so the structure is that you get a chapter of Zachary and then you get some weird fairy tale fragment or a bit of someone else's story. And for a lot of the book, it's pretty straight alternating chapters. That structure, I think, does break down a bit by the end in interesting ways. I did really like Zachary as a protagonist. There are things about him that I personally really identified with. I really clicked with his sense of humor, the way he thinks. He's a character I enjoyed spending time with and like I wanted to be friends with him. I don't hear people mentioning that this book has a queer romance, but it does. Zachary is gay. And his love interest, Dorian, was also an interesting character. I wish we had gotten more about him and his backstory, because there was a lot that was hinted at that we never actually got in full about his life and his history. There's another side character in this who I personally really loved, named Kat. I believe in the acknowledgements it said she's named after Kat Howard, which makes me happy because I also really love Kat Howard's writing. If you like The Starless Sea, you will probably enjoy Kat Howard's collection, A Cathedral of Myth and Bone. That's a recommendation. But the character Kat in this book is a minor character in the beginning of the book, and then she comes back in the end in the greatest way that I don't want to spoil, but I loved it. But now that I've covered the characters, the premise, and a bit of the structure of the book, I do want to talk about all of the sort of off the deep end weird stuff about this book, because that's what's either going to make it or break it for most readers. This has some things in common with The Night Circus, which of course is wildly popular, that I read several years ago. The first thing that I would say is very similar is that, like The Night Circus had, you know, its main storyline and its characters, but you felt that it was mostly actually about this circus, this place, this magical stuff. In The Starless Sea, you feel like this book, yes, it has characters and a plot, but it is mostly about this underground portal dimension with this so-called library that's not quite a library. It's more like a place where stories live. It's really a portal fantasy, and this is a portal world, although it's not quite presented like that. This is a book about that magical place, but it's this magical place that has all of this mythic, rich history that was once vibrant and thriving, but is now past its heyday. And not just the place, but the people who are in the know about it and care about it and have plans for it of one sort or another. And it really, really appealed to me. Part of what I loved about the circus in The Night Circus when I read it years ago is that it reminded me really strongly of like immersive theater, like Sleep No More. It also brought to mind to me the circus revival of Pippin that was on Broadway a while back that I was obsessed with for a while. So in that way, The Night Circus sort of played on some things I was very specifically into at the time I read it. The Starless Sea also has some of those immersive theater vibes in a way that's actually more blatantly acknowledged, because Zachary has all these like intellectual friends who talk about different forms of storytelling. But the main sort of point of stylistic reference here, I think, is video games, because Zachary is a game designer and an academic and a storyteller, and he's very into all of this stuff. And I myself am not a gamer, but this book sort of encapsulates all of the reasons that I would want to be. I think the barrier for me for getting into gaming is actually the technology and hardware side of things. I'm not really willing to invest in any of the equipment for it. But this book has the sort of enthusiasm for the art form that would make me want to change my mind. I could go on about why I loved this book, sort of rambling and gushing incoherently for a long time if I wanted to. But the writing is beautiful. The imagery it conjures is so fantastical and whimsical. It is the type of storytelling that asks you to completely suspend disbelief and like activate this sense of wonder. This is a book that is full of wonder and full of mystery and full of atmosphere. And personally for me, those are kind of the reasons I'm a fantasy reader, because I love all that stuff. And so I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I'll stop talking about it now. Next, we have to talk about The Priory of the Orange Tree, which was my least favorite of the bunch, but I'm not upset that I read it. I didn't hate it. I did have a hard time getting into this. I read like the first, I don't know, small portion of it, and then ended up putting it aside for a couple of months because a big epic fantasy was for a while there not what I could handle in my pandemic mood at all. But yeah, this is a big traditional fantasy epic. I'm realizing that it's interesting that all three of these books are from authors I've read before, and so my opinions are a little bit shaped by comparing and contrasting with the previous works by these authors that I've read. But even though in terms of like subgenre, Priory is a really different type of story from the Bone season. Only the first book of that series I've read, by the way, so I can't speak to the rest of the series. But also, obviously, the story structure is really different because this is a big, massive standalone. That said, the one thing I felt like these two books by Samantha Shannon that I've read had in common is that she is maybe a little too enamored of her own world-building skills for my taste. When I read the Bone season years ago now, before I joined BookTube, it was a long time ago, I remember feeling like the author was sort of treating that book as an excuse to show off how much complicated world building she could do. You got so much magic system, so much alternate history plus sci-fi. I hesitate to use the word info dump because I don't like it, because a lot of things that people categorize as info dumps are things that I actually don't mind. But I felt like the actual characters and relationships and story in the Bone season were not well done. It was just like this vehicle for all of this stuff, all of this world building. And I feel like the Priory of the Orange Tree is a step up from the Bone season in terms of the characters. They were, for the most part, with a couple exceptions, more likable. They felt more well-rounded. They felt more real to me than the characters in the Bone season did. Their choices and actions made a little bit more sense. But the more of this book I read, the more I felt like the whole point of the reading experience was just to put together all of the puzzle pieces of the world building that I was being given. And it is more of a putting together the puzzle pieces type of experience than a hey, here's an info dump type of experience. But it has a similar effect for me of feeling like this is a story that's not really about the story, it's about hey, here's a lot of world building. And I think this is something that specifically drives me away from a lot of big epic fantasy, especially if the world building for me doesn't ring totally true. So what sort of world is this? This is a world with 3 major regions across 2 different continents. They're referred to as the West, the East, and the South, and the West and the South are the North and South of the same continent, and then there's another continent that's East. The West is roughly European-ish. The South is maybe like roughly Middle Eastern-ish, maybe Africa too on the side, and then the East is roughly Asian-ish. There are multiple countries in each of these regions, but not too many, because you have to be able to keep track of them all, because heaven forbid there be countries in a world of a fantasy book that aren't relevant to the plot. We have 4 point of view characters that we switch between all throughout the book. 2 of them start their stories in the West, 2 of them start their stories in the East, but they all do a decent amount of traveling by the time the story is done. This is a world with dragons. It's a dragon book, and true to the East versus West inspiration of the world building, the dragons in the West are evil beings of fire, and the dragons in the East are benevolent beings of water. The character who I thought was really the main protagonist of the book is Eid. Her name is spelled E-A-D. I'm assuming that's pronounced Eid. Eid is from the South, but she is deep undercover in the court of Queen Sabrin of Innis, one of the northern nations, and the nation that is the seat of the northern faith known as Virtuedom. The origin myth of the faith of Virtuedom is tied to the royal house of Innis, and that origin myth is really central to the book, specifically the belief that the royal bloodline is what is keeping the biggest, scariest fire dragon being the nameless one from Rising Again. But Ede is from a place called the Priory of the Orange Tree that we learn subscribes to an alternate version of that founding myth. And then these sort of faith struggles are pitted against the religion of the East, where they worship their benevolent dragons. And in the West, they hate dragons so much because their dragons are the evil ones that they won't have any contact whatsoever with the East, and it is mutual. Anyways, premise of the book, the bad dragons are rising again for who knows why, and Sabrin hasn't had an heir yet to ensure the continuation of the bloodline that they believe will keep the Nameless One at bay. The main romance of this book is in this storyline, and it is between Ede and Sabrin, though it takes a long time to get off the ground. The other main characters, I would say that Tane is the other real protagonist of the book, although she didn't get nearly as many chapters focusing on the early part of her story as I would have wanted, given how important she ended up being. Tane is in the East. She's training to become a dragon rider. She comes from nothing. It's this great honor to be selected to be a dragon rider. She's been training her whole life, sacrificing everything for this dream, but she does something at the beginning of the book that puts that dream in jeopardy for her. Tane reminded me a little bit of Rin from the Poppy War, not just because of the Asianish setting, which is, in this book at least, like very loosely Asianish, but because she is a character who's been going through this intense, rigorous training where she is disadvantaged because she doesn't come from a dragon riding bloodline, and she can be like straight up ruthless in getting what she wants. So I would say Rin and Ede are the two main protagonists, and then the two sort of secondary point of view characters are Arteloth and what's his name? Niclays. I did not like Niclays. I erased him from my memory. But Arteloth is a close friend of both Ede and Sabrin. He's a nobleman, and he gets sent off on a perilous journey. Niclays is a Westerner living in exile in the East, where they are afraid that Westerners will spread a draconic plague, so they keep, you know, the few Westerners who are allowed to visit, like, isolated on this little island. And he's miserable, and he is not a good person. Niclays is a scholar, doctor, anatomist with a particular interest in alchemy. Mostly he's just a sad sack, and I think you're supposed to pity him. But he consistently behaves in his own self-interest in ways that are not becoming, do not endear him to anyone. Every time I got to one of his chapters, I kind of just stopped and cringed and like put the book aside for a while because I didn't want to read about him. It was unpleasant. And then I would pick the book back up again, and that chapter would end up only being a few pages, and it would be all right, and I'd keep reading. But it sort of just stopped me in my tracks every time we got to one of his chapters. I didn't enjoy it. So why didn't I enjoy the sprawling world building of this book? I didn't like it because it's the sort of thing that feels overly complicated until you get to the end and realize that it was overly simplistic, because you learned sort of everything of relevance in this entire world in one book. That's not how real worlds work. I mean, I only know of one real world, and certainly you wouldn't learn everything relevant about the nations and faiths and relations between all of the countries in our world in the course of one novel. This is an instance where leaving an element of mystery in a fantasy novel makes it actually much more convincing and believable to me. I can't believe in a world where everything is solvable. Nothing is unknowable. By the end of this book, we have like solved the mysteries of like what happened back when these religions were founded. History is never actually that straightforward, guys. In the real world, the more you learn about history, the more you realize you don't know. And I do understand that this is like hugely a matter of preference in what you like in fantasy world building. Even though this is like the majority of my wrap-up for this video is focusing on this, it isn't really the reason that I only gave this book 3 stars. I didn't dock a lot of points for it not being my type of world building. This is sort of a thing where if like the Priory of the Orange Tree is on one end of a spectrum, a scale going from like fantasy where you know, things are explained and they make sense, and it's very world-building-y, and the Starless Sea being like the polar opposite on that spectrum, where everything is mysterious and atmospheric. I am firmly in this camp of fantasy storytelling as opposed to this camp of fantasy storytelling. What I think I did dock points for that sort of hampered my reading experience is the sort of sense of where the conflict comes from in this book. I do sometimes really like traditional epic fantasy, traditional high fantasy storytelling. Stuff with court intrigue and politics between kingdoms and all of that. And when it works for me, when it's like, yes, I'm enjoying this, give me more of this, it's usually because you have a cast of really, really whip-smart characters who are outsmarting each other because they have opposing goals, and that's where the conflict comes from. The conflict in this book comes from the fact that all of the characters and all of the nations more broadly are too bigoted and narrow-minded to see that they would all be better off if they were working together. And that might actually be more realistic to how things are in the real world, but it isn't fun for me to read about. I spent a lot of this book just wanting to shake people. Anyway, that's The Priory of the Orange Tree. I gave it 3 stars. It isn't bad. It's not a bad book. It will be what some people really, really want in an epic fantasy. It wasn't what I tend to really want in an epic fantasy, although I did like Jade as a protagonist, and I was rather fond of some of the supporting cast as well. Okay, one more book, Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is the shortest of the 3. It was, I think, possibly the quickest for me to read, and it's also probably the sort of simplest and most straightforward to talk about. This is a historical fantasy novel set in 1920s Mexico with Mayan mythology. It's about a girl named Cassiopeia who is sort of the poor relation of her very, very wealthy, well-to-do family. Her mother had run away from home to marry a man that the family disapproved of because he was indigenous. And there are definitely elements of racism and colorism in Mexico that are addressed in this story. But Cassiopeia's father died, and so she and her mother had to move back in with the family that disapproves. And she is resentful and defiant of this situation and all of the injustices that she faces, and she sort of dreams nebulously of escape. Although what exactly that life would be for her is a little ill-defined. So Cassiopeia, great character. I think she's very well written and I like her. This story really kicks off when Cassiopeia is left at home alone, and she sneaks in and unlocks this chest of her grandfather's that is never supposed to be opened. And it turns out what's in there is the bones of a Mayan god. Huncame is one of the twin gods of the Mayan underworld, Xibalba. I actually don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's how I was hearing it in my head the whole time. But Huncame is freed from the chest by Cassiopeia. It turns out he was locked in there by his brother, who stole the throne of the underworld with the help of Cassiopeia's grandfather. Now Huncame and Cassiopeia are bound together by a bone shard of his that's in her finger. He is being kept alive by her life force, but if this goes on long enough without him regaining his full power, she will die and he will become human. And he's becoming gradually more human as he drains more and more of her life force. So they head off on this quest to retrieve these items that will bring Huncame back to his full power and glory. And the one thing that I didn't like about this book is that this mythology quest premise is pretty color by number. It reminded me a bit of reading Aru Shah last year in the middle grade category, where you get like, surprise! Mythology is real. Here are the gods, and here is the quest, and here are the things you have to do along your quest. But the benefit in this book is that it gives this sort of premise and structure on which to sort of hang all of these lovely descriptions of different cities in Mexico and a little bit in southern United States, but mostly Mexico. Moreno-Garcia uses a sort of omniscient narrator voice to describe all of these places that Cassiopeia and Huncame travel in really interesting ways, sort of describing the character of these cities and the historical context. That's just so much fun to read. The 3 books of hers that I've read so far, this one, The Beautiful Ones, and Prime Meridian, are very different books with very different sort of subgenres within SFF, but one thing that they all have in common that I really like is that Moreno-Garcia does a really good job describing sort of vintage glitz and glamour. And I enjoyed that in this book a lot, while the sort of omniscient narrator voice let the author sort of give us some more cultural context and social commentary that Cassiopeia, as a point of view character, for example, wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate on her own. We then also get some interspersed chapters of the opposition to these 2 travelers. Vakub Kame enlists the help of Cassiopeia's nemesis, her cousin Martine, who is this entitled rich boy. He's the heir to the family fortune, and he hates Cassiopeia because she has the guts to stand up to him and like tell him a no, and no one else in his life ever does that. And the Cassiopeia-Martine dynamic comes to sort of reflect the Huncame-Vakub-Kame dynamic in interesting ways that aren't necessarily predictable. I really enjoyed that. The other thing that was not predictable for me that I really enjoyed was the ending of this book. I won't spoil it for you, but given the reviews that I had seen of this book, I had sort of been led to expect something else from the ending of this book that I don't think I would have liked as much, and what I got I really loved. The sort of whole final confrontation portion of this story got magical on like another level from the rest of the book, and I really loved it. So I gave this 4 stars. It wasn't like the blow me out of the water 5-star read that I had sort of been hoping it would be when I pre-ordered it, but still I thought this was a really solid book. So to sum that up, my personal ratings for the adult fantasy category in this year's BooktubeSFF Awards are The Starless Sea, number 1, Gods of Jade and Shadow, number 2, and The Priory of the Orange Tree, number 3. Let me know if you've read any of these books. If you agree with me, disagree with me, let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.